In the most upscale restaurant in the city, every single employee on the floor burst into laughter the moment they finalized their plan. They had decided, with the kind of deliberate cruelty that only boredom and arrogance can produce together, to pair the restaurant's most underpaid and overlooked waitress with a quiet, middle-aged man who came in alone every week, a man they had taken to calling, behind his back, the silent failure. He was deaf. He dressed plainly. He drove an old pickup truck and never ordered anything extravagant. And to them, that combination of disability and apparent poverty made him the perfect target. They imagined the evening playing out like a comedy routine, the awkward waitress stumbling through interaction with a man who couldn't hear her, the two of them fumbling through dinner, while the rest of the staff and half the dining room watched and whispered. It was meant to humiliate both of them in one clean stroke. But within just a few days of that evening, a procession of black limousines began appearing at the restaurant's entrance, one after another, with uniformed drivers stepping out and waiting in silence. And when the man's true identity was finally spoken aloud in that dining room, the people who had laughed the loudest went very, very quiet, because they had just insulted the man who could purchase the entire restaurant chain with a single signature on a single page. Her name was Claire Donnelly, and she was 28 years old, which meant she had been working doubles since she was 19. She had come to the city from a small town in rural Ohio with a second-hand suitcase and a practical understanding that life did not hand anything to anyone, and that the only way forward was to show up every day and earn it. She had found work at Meridian, one of the most well-regarded fine dining establishments downtown, not because she had connections or a resume that impressed anyone, but because the hiring manager had been short-staffed on a Thursday afternoon, and Claire had walked in at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right answer to every interview question. She was hired on the spot, trained over a weekend, and on the floor by Monday. That had been 3 years ago. In those 3 years, she had learned every dish on the menu, memorized the wine list, handled difficult guests with patience that bordered on sainthood, and never once called in sick even when she genuinely should have stayed home. She lived in a 2-room apartment, 14 blocks from the restaurant, in a building where the elevator had not worked in over a year, and the heating was unreliable from October through March. She paid her rent on time every month, and kept a small savings account that she added to slowly, cautiously, the way someone does when they know there is no safety net beneath them. Claire was the kind of person who got taken advantage of not because she was naive, but because she believed in doing her share and then some. If a coworker needed someone to cover a shift, Claire usually said yes. If a table needed to be reset in a hurry, she did it without being asked. If a guest sent back a dish, she was the one who walked to the kitchen to smooth things over between the table and the chef without turning it into a drama. Her tips should have been good, given how attentive and professional she was. But at Meridian, tips were pooled and distributed according to a system that nobody had ever sat down and explained in writing. And the distribution had a way of favoring certain people, the louder ones, the ones who were close to management, the ones who had been there longest and knew how the informal politics worked. Claire had raised the question once, politely, and had been met with such a wall of social coldness from her coworkers that she had never raised it again. She simply kept working, kept showing up, kept being exactly who she was. The man who changed everything was named Daniel Merritt. He was 38 years old, though he could have passed for younger or older depending on the light and the expression on his face. He was not a tall man, and he was not the kind of man who filled a room with his presence the way some people do not, through any fault of his own, but simply because he had learned, somewhere along the way, to take up exactly as much space as he needed, and no more. He had been deaf since his early 20s, the result of a progressive condition that had taken his hearing gradually and then completely over the course of several years. He communicated primarily through American Sign Language, and when that was not possible, through a text-to-speech application on his phone that he used with the ease of someone who had long since made peace with the tool. He read lips well enough to follow a conversation in good lighting, and he had a habit of watching people's faces with an attentiveness that sometimes made them uncomfortable, as though he were reading something in them that they hadn't intended to show. He drove a dark green pickup truck that was at least a decade old, wore jeans and plain button-down shirts in neutral colors, and ate dinner alone at Meridian every Tuesday and Thursday evening without variation. He always took the same table near the window. He always ordered thoughtfully, not extravagantly. He always left a generous tip in cash, folded under the edge of his water glass, but he did it quietly, without any of the ceremony some guests used to signal their own generosity. Nobody at Meridian knew his last name. The reservation was always under D, Merit. Nobody had ever thought to look further. The staff had noticed him over the weeks in the way that restaurant workers notice regulars cataloging details, assigning labels, building a narrative that was more fiction than fact. They knew he was deaf because they had seen him use the phone app and the sign language. They knew he drove an old truck because the valet parking attendant had mentioned it once with a smirk. They assumed he was unemployed, or at best working something menial, because he always arrived at 6 in the evening on weekdays, as if he had no office to return to and no schedule that mattered. They had decided, collectively and without much reflection, that he was a lonely, struggling man with nothing notable about him. And they treated him accordingly civilly, because the restaurant required that, but without any of the extra warmth they extended to guests they considered worth impressing. The plan to use Claire and Daniel as entertainment had been hatched by a group of her co-workers during a slow Tuesday afternoon, led primarily by a server named Brandon, who had been at Meridian for 6 years, and had developed the kind of seniority-based arrogance that sometimes grows in places where there is no meaningful accountability. Brandon had a following among certain members of the floor staff, a small cluster of people who laughed at his jokes and adopted his opinions as their own, because it was socially easier than forming independent ones. He had noticed, or claimed to have noticed, that Daniel always looked in Claire's direction when she passed his section. And he had decided this was funny. He had made the observation out loud during the staff meal before service, and from there, the plan had assembled itself with the momentum that casual cruelty often gathers, each person adding a detail, each laugh encouraging the next suggestion, until what had started as a joke had become something they actually intended to carry out. The restaurant's floor manager that week was a man named Gary, who was not actively cruel, but was passive in the way that allows cruelty to thrive. He had heard the plan and said nothing to stop it. On a Thursday evening in late October, when the dining room was at perhaps 2/3 capacity, and the air outside had turned cold enough that guests came in rubbing their hands together and grateful for the warmth, Brandon approached Claire before the shift began and told her that she had been assigned to cover the table by the window for the evening. It was Daniel's table. Claire had not been assigned that section before it belonged to another server, but she asked no questions, assumed there had been a scheduling change, and went to prepare. She did not know that 3 of her co-workers were already stationed at various points around the dining room, with the specific purpose of watching what happened. She did not know that Brandon had told Gary he had a funny situation developing, and that Gary had responded with a shrug that meant he would look the other way. She did not know any of it. She simply straightened her apron, tucked a small notepad into her pocket, and went to greet the man at the window table with the same professionalism she brought to every table she had ever worked. Daniel Merritt arrived at 6:12, right on schedule, and sat down with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. He had his phone already in his jacket pocket. He pulled out the menu not because he needed to read it, but because he always read it, out of a habit of attentiveness that extended to everything in his life. When Claire approached and introduced herself, she did so with a slight awkward hesitation. She had worked with deaf customers before, but not often, and she was briefly uncertain how to proceed, but she recovered quickly and gestured to the notepad she was holding, silently asking if she could write. Daniel watched her face, read her expression, and gave a small nod that said, "Yes, that works." She wrote her name, wrote a brief greeting, and turned the pad toward him. He read it, smiled a real smile, not performative, and typed something on his phone, which he tilted so she could see. "Nice to meet you, Claire. I'll have the usual. You can ask the kitchen, they know." She blinked, slightly surprised by the ease of it, and went to the kitchen. The chef did know. He plated the order without being told the details. Claire delivered it, and the evening should have ended there, unremarkably. except that on her way back to the service station, she heard laughter from behind the half wall near the bar. And she recognized Brandon's voice. And she felt, in the way that people who have been underestimated their whole lives feel these things, exactly what was happening. She did not confront anyone. She went back to the table near the window, sat down in the chair across from Daniel that had been left empty by the nearest guests, pulled out her notepad, and wrote, "I think I was sent to your table as a joke. I'm sorry. You deserve better than that." She turned the pad around. He read it. There was a pause, a real one, not dramatic, just a moment of a man reading words carefully and deciding how to respond. Then he picked up his phone and typed, "I've known for a few weeks. I keep coming back anyway. The food is good. And so is the company, it turns out." He tilted the phone. She read it, and something shifted. Quietly. In the way that meaningful things usually begin, not with fanfare, but with a simple exchange of honesty between two people who had each decided, independently, to be real. Over the next hour, while the dining room hummed and the kitchen clattered, and the co-workers who had set up the joke gradually lost interest because nothing humiliating was happening, Claire and Daniel talked. Not continuously, she had other tables. And she checked on them, refilled water glasses, brought checks when they were needed, but between those obligations, she returned to the window table, and they found a rhythm. She wrote, he typed, and occasionally he spoke in a voice that was slightly unmodulated in pitch, but entirely comprehensible, the voice of a man who had once heard himself speak and still remembered roughly how it felt. She listened without flinching, without the performative over-attentiveness that deaf people often encounter from hearing individuals who are trying too hard to show they aren't uncomfortable. She just listened, the way she listened to everyone. Directly, without judgment, with the full weight of her attention. She discovered that he had strong opinions about architecture, not in an academic way, but in the way of someone who had spent years looking at buildings and thinking about what made them feel like places people wanted to be in. She discovered that he had read, extensively, on topics ranging from economic history to Renaissance painting, and that he moved between these subjects the way someone moves through a house they know well, easily, without needing to consult a map. She discovered that he was funny, genuinely, unexpectedly funny, in the specific way that people who are very smart and have good timing tend to be, and that when she laughed at something he had written on his phone, his expression registered something that looked very much like relief. She could not have said exactly why he seemed relieved. She thought about it later, walking home through the cold, and decided it was because sometimes being heard is a relief, even when you are the one who cannot hear. He came back the following Tuesday. And the Thursday after that. The joke had long since been abandoned by Brandon and the others, who had found it unsatisfying since neither Claire nor Daniel had been visibly embarrassed by any of it. But Daniel kept coming, and Claire, who now knew his section, found herself looking forward to those evenings in a way she could not entirely explain. They had begun to vary their method of conversation. Sometimes she wrote full sentences, sometimes single words. Sometimes she spoke, and he read her lips under the warm dining room light, with that deep attentiveness of his. He taught her, over the course of several visits, how to sign a small number of phrases. Hello, thank you, I understand. That's a good idea. You're wrong about that. She practiced them at home. In her bathroom mirror, feeling slightly ridiculous and not minding. There was a particular evening, a Tuesday in early November, when the restaurant was quieter than usual, and the rain outside streaked the tall windows in long silver lines. When they had stayed in conversation for nearly an hour straight, longer than she had ever spent with any single table in 3 years of working the floor, he had asked her, through the phone, what she would do if she could do anything not what she planned to do. Not what was realistic, but what she would choose if the choice were genuinely open. She had been quiet for a moment, not because the question made her uncomfortable, but because nobody had asked her that in a long time, and she wanted to answer it truthfully. She had written, "Help people find work they don't hate, something that actually fits who they are." He had read that and been still for a moment, then typed, You'd be good at that. She had folded the notepad closed and looked at him and said out loud, slowly, "How do you know?" And he had looked back at her with the particular expression of a person who has been paying attention to something for long enough to be confident in what they've seen, and typed, "Because you do it already. You just don't call it that." Those words stayed with her for days afterward, surfacing at odd moments on the walk to work in the gray November mornings, in the back of her mind, while she carried plates and smiled at guests and moved through the familiar architecture of her shift. It was not flattery. She recognized flattery easily enough. She had been surrounded by the performative kind all her working life. The kind that restaurant managers used to motivate staff before cutting their hours, the kind that coworkers deployed when they needed a shift covered. This was something different. It was observation. It was a man who had been watching her work and had drawn a conclusion from the evidence. The way you draw conclusions from evidence when you are actually paying attention. She was not sure anyone had paid that kind of attention to her before, at least not anyone who had communicated it. It sat warmly in a place inside her that had been cold for a long time. One Sunday afternoon, not a work day, she was in a small cafe 2 neighborhoods away from the restaurant when she received a text. He had given her his number. Simply, in the same practical way he approached everything, saying only that it was easier than writing notes. The text said he was at the art museum on 5th and asked if she wanted to see the new Impressionist exhibition. She said yes. She walked 20 minutes to get there, arriving slightly out of breath, and found him standing in front of a large Monet water lily canvas with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at it with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything. They moved through the exhibition together for 2 hours, without any of the self-consciousness that first dates tend to carry, partly because neither of them had called it a date, and partly because they were both people who were more interested in things than in performing interest. He showed her, through typed notes, why certain paintings worked and others didn't, talking about light and spatial relationship and the psychology of color with the fluency of someone who had spent years thinking about it. She told him about a mural she had seen on a building in her neighborhood that she had always found beautiful and never quite understood why. He thought about that for a moment, and then typed, "Beautiful things don't require explanations. They require witnesses." She saved that message. There had been a moment, near the end of the exhibition, when they had stopped in front of a smaller canvas, a simple scene of a country road at dusk. Unsigned, its provenance listed as unknown. And she had felt him standing quietly beside her, and had thought, without any particular logic to support it, that this was the most comfortable she had been in someone's company in a long time. She did not say that out loud, but she held the feeling carefully. The way you hold something that you are not yet sure is yours to keep. There were, in those weeks, small things she noticed and filed away without drawing any firm conclusions. The first was the car. She had been leaving the restaurant after a late shift on a Tuesday, walking out the side entrance into the alley, where staff usually collected themselves before heading home, when she saw a black car, long, expensive, clearly a hired vehicle of the kind that was sent, rather than hailed, idling in the narrow street beyond the alley entrance. The driver was outside the car, in a dark uniform, and as Daniel came through the same exit behind Claire, the driver straightened and moved forward with a particular kind of promptness that people develop when they are in service to someone important. He had said something Claire could not quite hear, but the word was unmistakable in its shape on the driver's lips. Daniel had glanced at the car, then at the driver, and had given a small, calm shake of his head. The driver had nodded once and returned to the car without argument, without the kind of visible confusion that would accompany a case of mistaken identity. The car had pulled away. Daniel had reached into his jacket pocket for his keys, the ordinary ones that opened the old pickup truck, parked down the block, and had looked at Claire with an expression that was not quite sheepish and not quite amused, but somewhere in the middle. She had thought about asking. She had decided, for reasons she could not have fully articulated, to wait. There were other moments. A video call she glimpsed accidentally on his phone screen one evening when he'd left it face up on the table, with 3 suited figures visible on the other end, the kind of people whose clothes and bearing announced corporate seniority without requiring any other identification. Daniel had seen her glance, reached over calmly, and turned the phone face down. The call had presumably ended. He had simply folded his hands on the table and raised his eyebrows slightly in the universal expression of someone who is ready to change the subject. She had let him. Meanwhile, at Meridian, the situation had begun to deteriorate. Brandon had grown bored of his failed joke and replaced it with something uglier. A campaign of quiet insinuation. He began saying, just loudly enough to be overheard, that Claire was spending too much time with a particular customer. He implied, never directly but always clearly, that she was using the man leading him on, cultivating his attention for better tips, taking advantage of someone who was, as Brandon put it, not really in a position to understand what's happening. This was, of course, precisely backward from reality. Daniel was, in almost every sense, the most clear-eyed person in the building, but the insinuation had the desired effect. Other staff members began to treat Claire with a new flavor of coldness. Guests at adjacent tables, catching fragments of the staff's commentary during the moments when servers congregated near the service station, began to watch Claire with a different kind of attention. Gary, the floor manager, called Claire into the back office one afternoon and told her, with the tone of a man who has rehearsed his words carefully, that her personal interactions with guests were beginning to create a perception problem for the restaurant. He did not specify what perception. He did not have to. Claire sat through the conversation without letting her expression break, thanked him for the feedback she had not asked for, and went back to the floor. She cried in the walk-in refrigerator for approximately 90 seconds, then composed herself and went to take an order for a table of 8. Daniel, for his part, was not unaware of what was happening around him. He had spent his adult life in environments where people spoke freely in front of him, assuming that because he could not hear them, he could not understand. He had learned to read a room with a precision that hearing people rarely developed. To watch the quality of glances, the geometry of social positioning, the subtle signals in people's bodies that preceded what they were about to do. He saw how the staff moved around Claire now, the slight withdrawal, the pointed looks. He saw how Claire's posture had changed in the past 2 weeks, how she carried a new careful guardedness that she had not had before. He said nothing about it directly. He was not a man who moved quickly toward confrontation. But he was also not a man who ignored things. One evening in mid-November, the restaurant received confirmation of a large private event booking. A fundraising dinner for the Heartwell Foundation, a major philanthropy organization, which had reserved the entire private dining room for 40 guests on a Saturday night. It was the kind of booking that excited management, a prestigious event, well-connected attendees, the kind of evening that generated good press and good revenue. The private room was prepared with special attention. The chef designed a dedicated menu. Gary briefed the entire floor staff about the importance of perfect service. Nobody mentioned that Daniel Merritt had been quietly associated with the Heartwell Foundation for many years, because nobody at Meridian had ever thought to look into who Daniel Merritt actually was. The evening of the Heartwell Foundation dinner arrived with the particular charged quality of important occasions, the kitchen running faster, the floor staff moving with heightened focus, the dining room doing a brisk, regular service, while the private room filled with well-dressed guests who arrived in pairs and small groups, greeting each other with the ease of people who existed in the same circles and attended the same events year after year. Claire was working the main floor that evening, not the private event, and the shift had been going well enough. She was midway through the dessert course, at a foretop near the front, when she heard, from somewhere near the entrance to the private room, a sudden change in the quality of the noise, a kind of collective intake of breath, a reconfiguring of energy, the way a room sounds when something unexpected has happened, and every person in it is simultaneously trying to understand it. Daniel had walked in through the main entrance, as he always did, at his usual time, in his usual clothes. He had arrived for his regular Thursday dinner reservation. He had walked past the host's stand and nodded to the host, who had led him toward the window table. And then, from inside the open doorway of the private dining room, 3 people had seen him simultaneously, and all 3 had stopped, mid-conversation, mid-gesture, mid-sentence. The president of the Hartwell Foundation, a composed woman in her 60s named Margaret Crane, had crossed the room in 10 seconds flat. She had stopped in front of Daniel and bowed her head in a gesture that was not theatrical, but entirely genuine. The way someone acknowledges a person who has materially changed the course of their work. Behind her, 2 members of the foundation's board, both of whom had flown in from other cities for this event, followed. One of them said, clearly enough for a significant portion of the nearby dining room to hear, "Chairman, we didn't know you'd be here this evening. It's an honor." The other simply extended his hand and waited, with the patience of someone who knows you don't rush the person at the top. The dining room, or at least that part of it, went very still. Gary, standing near the service station reviewing a check, looked up. Brandon, who happened to be passing with a tray of water glasses, stopped walking. The host at the front stand glanced over, and then looked again, not quite believing what her eyes were reporting. Claire, carrying a small plate of mignardises to the foretop, turned at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right one, and saw Daniel standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the seated attention of several dozen well-dressed people, while 3 individuals who clearly occupied positions of considerable importance treated him with the specific, particular deference that is reserved, in every culture, for the person above whom there is nobody else in the room. Margaret Crane turned briefly to address Gary, who had moved closer out of an instinct he couldn't quite name, and said pleasantly, "We've been hoping to arrange a proper introduction for some time. Your establishment has been wonderfully accommodating for this event. Daniel speaks highly of it." Gary opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it again. Daniel, who had watched this entire exchange with the expression of a man who finds the situation mildly, affectionately amusing, typed something on his phone and showed it to Margaret, who laughed with the ease of a long professional relationship and nodded. What followed in the next 48 hours was the kind of institutional reckoning that organizations tend to resist until they cannot. A senior representative of the parent company that owned Meridian's entire restaurant group, a conglomerate with holdings across 11 cities, contacted the general manager the following morning. The conversation was brief. It was also, by several accounts, quite pointed. Within hours, a review process had been initiated that involved pulling surveillance footage from the previous 8 weeks of operation. The footage was reviewed by HR personnel, who had been flown in specifically for the purpose, which suggested the parent company took the matter seriously. What they found in that footage was not subtle, it was, in fact, quite clear. It showed Brandon and 2 other servers in staged conversations near Claire's section and postures, and with facial expressions that required no special interpretation. It showed Gary entering a conversation with those same servers and walking away without intervening. It showed Claire working, serving, maintaining her professionalism under conditions that the HR team's written summary later described as constituting a hostile work environment. It showed Daniel, on several occasions, sitting at his table and watching the dynamics around him with the calm, measured attention of a man who understood exactly what he was witnessing and had decided to let it play out until it was time not to. Brandon was terminated the following Wednesday. 2 of his closest associates on the floor staff received formal written warnings and were placed on performance review. Gary was relieved of his floor manager position and reassigned to a non-supervisory role, pending a further review of his management conduct. The restaurant issued a formal apology to Claire, delivered in writing by the general manager, who also offered her a raise and a change in her section assignment. The tip pooling system was restructured under new written guidelines that had to be signed by all staff. These were not small changes. They were the kind of changes that happen when the person who has been wronged happens to have the power to compel them, but Daniel had not asked for any of it directly. He had simply, when asked by the parent company's representative whether he wished to make any specific requests, said that he hoped the restaurant would be a better place for its staff to work, and that he would appreciate it if the particular individuals who had been involved in orchestrating the targeting of vulnerable employees were held appropriately accountable. He had been specific about one other thing. He had asked that Claire not be defined, going forward, by what had happened to her. He had asked that she be given an opportunity to choose her own direction. On the Thursday, after the week of investigations and departures, Daniel came in at 6:12, as always. He sat at the window table. Claire brought him water without being asked, sat in the chair across from him, and wrote on her notepad. "You could have said something, at any point." He read it, picked up his phone, and typed, "You were handling it. I didn't want to take that from you." She read it. She put down her pen. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you are revising your understanding of them upward, not because they have surprised you, but because you have finally understood something you were already seeing. She said, speaking slowly and clearly in the warm light, "Who are you?" "Really?" He smiled that same real smile from the very first evening, and typed, "A man who's been looking for someone who would ask that question last." The story of what Daniel Merritt actually was took some time to fully understand, and he told it to Claire in pieces over several weeks, in the way that private people share private things gradually, and only when trust has been established well enough to hold the weight of the information. He had grown up in Michigan, the son of a manufacturing engineer and a schoolteacher, in a household where money was not abundant but neither was it scarce, and where the prevailing ethic was that work had value and people had dignity, regardless of what either one produced in terms of income. He had studied finance and economics at a state university on a partial scholarship and had graduated into the particular economic conditions of the early 2000s, when the financial industry was simultaneously booming and beginning to develop the cracks that would eventually show themselves catastrophically. He had worked for 7 years at a mid-sized investment firm, learning the mechanics of capital markets, with the same deep attentiveness he brought to everything else. And during those years he had also begun, quietly, with small amounts of his own money, to test ideas that the larger firm was not interested in pursuing. He had been right, consistently, in the specific and verifiable way that markets confirm or deny investment theses. By the time his hearing had deteriorated to the point where it could no longer be worked around in a conventional office environment, he had accumulated enough of his own capital and enough of a track record to establish his own fund. The deafness had, in a way he did not pretend was simple or easy, but which he described as genuinely formative, forced him to build a professional environment that was designed for him, smaller, quieter, structured around written communication and careful analysis rather than the performative verbal culture of most financial firms. He had thrived in that environment. The fund had thrived, and over 15 years, through a series of careful, patient, well-researched investments, he had built something that even he sometimes had difficulty fully internalizing, a holding company with assets in excess of $2 billion, with interests in commercial real estate, hospitality, technology, and infrastructure across multiple states. He had been married once, to a woman named Rebecca, whom he had met in his early 30s, and whom he had loved with the same careful, attentive depth that characterized everything he did. She had died of a sudden cardiac event when she was 34 years old, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, leaving behind a 2-year-old son named Owen and a husband who had understood. In the months that followed, that grief at that depth is not something you recover from in any traditional sense. You simply learn, slowly and imperfectly, to carry it while continuing to move. He had raised Owen with the help of a devoted nanny and a close network of family. Owen was now 12. A thoughtful child, who communicated in sign language as naturally as he spoke, who understood that his father's silence was not absence, but a different kind of presence, and who had inherited, from somewhere in the combination of nature and nurture that shapes children, a quality of attentiveness that his father recognized in him with deep, quiet pride. Daniel had kept his financial life private not out of shame or strategy, exactly, but out of a hard-won understanding that wealth changes the way people see you before they see you. He had watched it happen to colleagues and contemporaries, had watched the way people's behavior shifted in the presence of money. How warmth became interest. How respect became deference. How authentic connection became nearly impossible to find beneath the layers of performance that money tends to provoke. He had lost Rebecca before any of this was fully true. when they had still been people who argued about whose turn it was to buy groceries, and her death had crystallized something in him that he might otherwise have arrived at more gradually. That the only way to know whether a relationship was real was to enter it without the advantage of the wealth. To be seen first as a man, and only later, if at all, as a man who happened to also be rich. He had structured his life accordingly. He drove the old truck because it was a reliable truck, and because it asked nothing of him. He dressed simply because he had never particularly cared about clothes, and because the simplicity served his purpose. He ate at restaurants he liked because the food was good, and because he needed, like everyone, to be somewhere other than his own home in the evenings. He had noticed Claire on his third visit to Meridian, not because she was the most beautiful person in the room, though she was attractive in the way that people who are entirely genuine tend to be, but because she was the only person on the floor who had spoken to him through writing, as though he were simply a person and not a situation to be managed. She had asked, on that third visit, whether he preferred to communicate through writing or through the phone app, and she had asked it with the straightforward practicality of someone who wanted to know the answer in order to do her job better, not out of the fascinated curiosity that his deafness sometimes provoked in people. It was a small thing, but small things, observed carefully, tell you a great deal. The weeks that followed the revelation at Meridian brought several changes. Claire was offered, and accepted, a position with the Hartwell Foundation's Employment Initiative, a program specifically focused on vocational training and job placement for individuals with disabilities, including hearing loss. She discovered, in that work, a capacity for organizational thinking that her years of waitressing had developed but never quite found a proper channel for. She was good at it, at seeing the practical needs of the people the program served, at bridging the gap between what the program offered on paper and what participants actually needed to succeed. She poured herself into it with the same work ethic she had always had. But for the first time in her working life, she ended the day feeling that something had been built rather than merely maintained. Daniel, for his part, continued to come to Meridian occasionally, not as a regular, but as someone with a reason to be there, a reason that had nothing to do with the food, and everything to do with the woman who no longer worked there. They moved through the city together in the unhurried way of two people who are not in a hurry, because they have both, separately, already learned what rushing produces. They went back to the art museum several times. They attended a lecture series on urban development that Daniel thought Claire would find interesting, and he had been right. They took Owen to the Natural History Museum on a Sunday in December, and Claire had spent 45 minutes at the dinosaur exhibit, communicating with the 12-year-old in a combination of written notes and the handful of signs she had learned, while Owen had watched her with the particular, unsentimental appraisal of a child who is deciding whether a new person in his parents' life is the real thing. By the time they left, Owen had asked Claire, in sign, whether she was going to keep coming around. She had signed back, correctly enough to be understood. "I hope so." Owen had given a single nod that conveyed, with remarkable economy, that this answer was acceptable. They were married in the spring of the following year, 14 months after the evening when Claire had sat down across from Daniel at the window table and written, "I think I was sent to your table as a joke. I'm sorry. You deserve better than that." The wedding was held at a small historic church on the east side of the city, with a guest list of approximately 60 people, family, close friends, several members of the Hartwell Foundation team, and a small number of Daniel's professional colleagues who had earned over the years the right to be called genuine friends. There was no media presence. Daniel had requested explicitly that there not be, and his requests tended to be honored. The flowers were simple and seasonal. The dinner that followed was cooked by a chef who was a close friend of Daniel's, not catered by a production company. Owen served as his father's best man, standing beside him at the front of the church in a suit he had picked out himself and wearing the expression of a person who is taking a serious thing seriously. The ceremony included both spoken and signed elements, because the people gathered there communicated in both languages, and it was right that both should be honored. When it came time for Daniel to say his vows, he had prepared what he wanted to say, with the care he brought to everything that mattered. He began in sign language, fluid and precise, his hands moving through the words he had chosen with the clarity of a person speaking in their primary language. And then, and this was known only to Owen and to one or two others who had helped him prepare for it, he shifted. He spoke. His voice was the voice of a man who had not relied on it for many years, who had practiced in the privacy of his own space, who had wanted to give this one thing in the form it would be most directly received. Thank you for seeing who I was before you knew what I was. That is the thing I will carry longest. His voice was slightly uneven, in the way that voices are when they are not regularly used, but it was entirely clear. And the words were entirely his, and there was not a person in that church who did not understand exactly what they meant. Claire did not attempt to compose herself. She did not try to hold back what she felt. She pressed her hand over her mouth and let the tears come freely, because that is what you do when someone gives you something true in the most direct way they know how, and she had always believed that the right response to truth was to meet it honestly. The guests rose without being asked. The applause started in the front row and moved backward through the church, and then just kept going, the way applause does when it is not merely polite, but is actually the sound of 60 people feeling the same thing at the same time. They left the church through the old wooden doors at the back, into the soft gold light of a late afternoon in May, and walked down the steps together with their hands joined. Owen walked just behind them, already loosening his tie with the pragmatic efficiency of a 12-year-old who has fulfilled his duties and sees no reason to maintain formality beyond that point. The cars belonging to some of the guests were parked along the street. There were a few nice ones in the group, because some of Daniel's associates had not taken to heart his preference for simplicity, but parked at the far end of the block. Unchanged was the dark green pickup truck. Someone had tied a small ribbon to the antenna, which Daniel had not authorized, and which he noted with a look of mild exasperation that contained, underneath it, genuine amusement. He walked to it, opened the passenger door for Claire, who climbed in without ceremony, and walked around to the driver's side. Owen got in the back seat and immediately began working on the tie knot, which had apparently become more complicated than anticipated. Daniel started the engine. It turned over with the reliable, low rumble of a well-maintained vehicle that had earned trust over years of ordinary use. He looked over at Claire. She looked back at him. There was nothing that needed to be said right at that moment, which is one of the most valuable things that can be true of two people sitting together in a truck. He put it in drive and pulled out into the street, and the late afternoon light came through the windows at an angle that turned everything it touched into something worth looking at. What Daniel Merritt had built over 15 years of careful work, the capital, the holdings, the institutional reputation, the disciplined patience of a man who understood the long game was real, and it mattered, and it had done good in the world, and would continue to do so. But it was not the thing he would have pointed to if you had asked him, in that moment, what he valued most. The thing he valued most was sitting next to him, looking out at the street with the same clear-eyed directness that had made him notice her in the first place, in a restaurant where everyone had decided they already knew what both of them were worth before they had asked a single honest question. She had asked. He had answered. Everything else had followed from that. The lesson was not complicated. It did not require a business degree, or a philosophy, education, or any particular advantage of birth or circumstance to understand. It was simply this: that the value of a person is not located in their bank account, their title, their address, their physical ability, or any of the other surfaces by which we habitually and lazily sort each other into categories of worth. It is located somewhere much harder to see, and therefore much easier to miss, and it requires a different kind of attention entirely. The kind that Claire Donnelly had been bringing to people her whole life. Without recognition, without reward, without any particular expectation that it would someday change everything. It had, in the end, changed everything. Not because virtue is always rewarded in the world, it often isn't, but because this time, and in this place, the right person had been watching, and he had seen her clearly, and she had seen him first. There will always be people like Brandon, who measure others against a rubric, assembled from status and appearances, and find a kind of satisfaction in the verdict. There will always be workplaces like the one Claire endured, where the informal rules reward the wrong things, and the people who could stop it look away because it's easier. These are not new problems. They run in the ordinary current of human life, surfacing daily in small ways that rarely produce dramatic conclusions. But occasionally, in the particular quiet way that reality tends to correct itself when given enough time, the rubric reveals its own failure. The man in the old truck turns out to be the man who owns the building. The woman who was handed the worst shifts and the smallest portion of the tips turns out to be the one whose integrity was the most valuable thing in the room all along. The people who laughed are left with the knowledge of what they did, which is its own kind of consequence. And two people who were placed together as a joke walk out of a church in the spring light and drive away in an old green truck, and what they carry with them is not a lesson about wealth or power, or the danger of making assumptions, though all of that is present. What they carry is simpler and older and worth more. The knowledge that they were seen. Truly, fully, accurately seen by each other. Before anything else was known. That is the kind of thing that holds. And in a world that moves fast and values loudly and measures constantly, it is also, quietly, the rarest thing of all.